Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to start talking about chapter 51. And I always think this one's pretty interesting because we're going to delve into animal behavior. So, your textbook starts off with this sort of case study on these fiddler crabs. And somebody somewhere along the way had kind of noticed that these little guys kind of sit there and they've got this smaller claw and this really large claw, and they sort of engage in this waving behavior. Um, and so somewhere along the way, somebody said, well, why the heck do they do this? And of course, over studying these organisms, you probably come up with two quick, obvious answers, right? Most of these unique body forms often come back to some sort of reproductive um, success. So when we look at these guys, why would they have evolved to look like this? Well, it's ultimately going to come down to that it benefits them in some way to either repel other males or attract females or some combination of the both, because evolution really is driven by making sure that that organism is more suited for its environment. As a result, it's more suited because it's capable of producing more offspring than some other individual. And so their set of traits is what gets passed on more often, and the more individuals with that suite of characteristics is more successful at reproducing, the more those genes get passed on. And so the more their population begins to look like that. So let's break this down. If we're going to talk about animal behavior, we need to make sure we define what we're dealing with as a definition for behavior for our purposes. And so your textbook defines behavior as the nervous system's response to a stimulus. We're going to come to talking about the nervous system later this year and what that actually looks like from a physiological standpoint. But today we're going to talk about what that behavior in terms of that response to the stimulus looks like in a more general term sense. And really, we're getting at that nervous system sees the stimulus, feels the stimulus, perceives the stimulus in some way, shape, or form. Your brain is going to figure out what that information is, process it, and then ultimately send signals back down to either your muscular system or your hormonal system to carry out some sort of action. In this case, what we would define as behavior. So, when we look at behavior from a behavioral ecologist standpoint, we're looking at what is an animal doing, how is it doing it, and how does it learn to do it. And all of this is ultimately subject, at least for our purposes, from a standpoint of natural selection. What is the benefit to the organism as a result, the benefit to the species, and why does this continue to happen generation after generation? So, if you're talking about the study of animal behavior, we're really talking about this field of ethology. And so, let's sort of delve into the basics of what that particular field looks like. So, first and foremost, when we're looking at behavior from in the animal kingdom, we can really pull this out into two pathways or two categories. Is that particular behavior we're observing innate, or is it learned? And so, what does that mean? How do we differentiate those two categories? Well, an innate behavior, this is a behavior that's sort of instinctive. It seems to be inherited, so perhaps there's some sort of genetic component to it. It's automatic, it's consistent, it's the same from every time that individual is exposed to that stimulus, the behavioral response is identical. Same thing when we go from one individual to the next. So long as the stimulus remains the same, the behavior remains the same. So there really isn't any variation or very minimal variation between them. That being said, if we talk about a learned behavior, this is some modification of a behavior based on specific experiences, right? They had to experience something to then learn the response that was appropriate to that stimulus. And so as a result, there can be considerably more variation between individuals in the population, and perhaps even from that single individual, they may tailor that response as they get more and more experienced with that stimulus. So the ability itself to learn, we definitely believe has some sort of inherited genetic component to some degree. But the behavior adapts and develops during the lifetime. So the behavior itself, unlike that innate behavior, is not something that they are going to be able to just be born with and know how to do. So there's a lot more variability, a lot more flexibility in learned behavior than there is in something innate. If we want to apply this to humans, maybe just to kind of give you an example, we talk about an innate behavior being something like the ability to suckle. So a newborn baby knows how to do that suckling motion in order to try and get food. That being said, they aren't always so good at it. And so the more experience they have with feeding, the better they become. So that behavior is actually kind of going to fall into both categories. They just know how to do it. But that being said, they can learn how to get better at it as time goes on. So as we work through this particular chapter, we'll also continue to come back to some of this stuff throughout the school year. There really are four major central questions that we can talk about when we look at and observe animal behavior. And Nico Tinnenberger is kind of given the credit for coming up with these four questions that sort of surround the study of animal behavior. So first question simply is to define what the stimulus is. What is the thing in that organism's external or maybe even internal environment that is eliciting some sort of behavior? And then what is the physiological responses that are mediating that? So, how is that information getting to that organism's brain? How is it getting processed? And then how is that brain sending back a particular response? So, very much a physiological mechanism there, really where your nervous system, your muscular system, your hormonal system all sort of work together. Second question, how does the animal's experience during its growth and development influence that response? So is this a behavior that can be learned? Either they're learning the behavior from the get-go, and so there really is no know-how from birth, or is it something that they sort of have some level of an instinct, like the suckling behavior I just mentioned, and then they develop and shape and get better at that behavior over time? Third question, how does that behavior ultimately end up aiding the organism's survival and reproduction? And then that really comes back to what's the evolutionary history of that behavior. So those last two questions really are driving at the evolutionary biology behind the animal behavior. Why is this organism doing it? What's the benefit to it as not only an individual, but why does it continue to happen generation after generation? Because clearly that means that there must be some evolutionary benefit to it, especially when we see it across the entire population. So when we look at behavioral ecology, right, the study of ecological and evolutionary basis for animal behavior, this is going to integrate those four questions, really fitting into the explanations for why we see these behaviors. So we're going to talk about them as either proximal causation or ultimate causation. So how the behavior occurs or why it's happening. So if you go back to these four questions, right? What's the stimulus and how's the body managing and mediating the response? How does the organism learn that response as it grows and develops? What's the behavioral aid to its survival and reproduction? What's its evolutionary history? So those are the four questions we're going to talk about. And if I look at this, question 1 and 2 about the physiological mechanisms as well as just how the body sort of learns to adjust in its muscle memory, in its hormonal changes, whatever the case might be, those are proximal causation questions. They're addressing how the behavior occurs or how it's modified throughout that organism's life. So they're how or what questions. The ultimate causation goes back to the evolutionary piece. Why is this behavior occurring within the context of that natural selection? How is this behavior not only allowing that organism to survive better than other individuals in the population, but how is it also ensuring better reproductive success? And you need to have both survival and reproduction in order to really qualify for natural selection because it's all genetically based. In order for that trait to continue, it has to have some sort of genetic component. And in order for natural selection to work on it, it has to be able to be some sort of genetic component that gets passed on because it ultimately is only your genes that get passed on from one generation to the next and are capable of shaping the gene pool and the traits of a population. So these are much more why questions. Why are they happening? Why is this helping them succeed? Or why is it not? Why is it perhaps going the opposite direction and getting weeded out of the population because it's more maladaptive than beneficial?